morning, everybody. Good morning. It's JPR, and welcome back to another video. Okay, have you ever stopped to think about what defines a legendary Pokemon? Are they one of a kind? Well, maybe at one point, but we know that isn't true most of the time. Are they powerful? Well, yes, but pseudo-legendaries are ironically stronger than a lot of actual legendaries. Okay, so do they have legends associated with them? Yes, but so do a lot of average Pokemon like Ninetales or Absol. Point is, sometimes the lines between a regular Pokemon and a legendary Pokemon are a bit hazier than we'd like them to be. Sometimes to the point where several Pokemon have either accidentally been labeled as legendary at some point, or they've just generally confused the masses for many years. I think the best example that first comes to mind is Rotom. Despite being a relatively weak Pokemon, Rotom checks all the boxes of being a legendary Pokemon. When it was first introduced in Pokemon Diamond and Pearl, it was seemingly one of a kind, could only be encountered during the postgame, and it even had the Sinnoh legendary battle theme. If that doesn't sound like identity theft, I don't know what does. It also didn't help that the Pokemon Diamond and Pearl handbook, which could be found at any scholastic book fair across the country, stated quite clearly at the top this was a legendary Pokemon. However, these handbooks were quite notorious for having a multitude of errors buried in them. Like saying the Hitmons can evolve into each other, or Zangoose being the car ferret Pokemon. And of course, this same book also lists Delibird, Spinda, and Spiritomb as legendary Pokemon. But hey, most of us didn't know any better and just took the info found in these Pokedex books at face value. Pokemon Platinum would further complicate this issue, as Rotom became only the second Pokemon to have event-exclusive forms after Deoxys. Bear in mind, it wasn't until Gen 5 where mythical Pokemon and legendary Pokemon would officially be recognized as different groups outside of Japan. So we all considered Deoxys a legendary back then, making it even easier to compare it to Rotom. And because Rotom's many forms were introduced mid-generation, this also meant that Rotom was banned from Gen 4 online competitions. A restriction that was usually reserved for legendary Pokemon only. Usually the main way of debunking that Rotom was a legendary was the fact that it could breed, but it just so happened to be introduced in Gen 4. The same gen that gave us an actual breeding legendary, Manaphy. Remember, legendaries and mythicals were the same back then in English material. And since Manaphy could breed and still be considered legendary, why would Rotom be an exception? Well, that's a whole different can of worms, but that does lead us to another peculiar case of a Pokemon, Fioni. If you thought Rotom was confusing, well, at least we eventually figured out it wasn't legendary. As for Fioni, its status as a legendary/mythical is still debated to this very day.
Fioni is absolutely a mythical Pokemon. I'm friends with many mythical Pokemon, and Fioni is one of the most mythical Pokemon there is anywhere in the world.
Stop the cap, Donald. You know Fioni doesn't deserve to be a mythical.
Typical fake news from Sleepy Joe. Fioni is as mythical as the people who voted for you.
Will you just shut up, man?
Are you using your webcam mic or something, Sleepy?
Why don't we just let JPR tell us the facts?
Make mythicals great again.
It all started on Pokemon.com's fan mail section, where a fan innocently asked, is Fioni a legendary Pokemon? The answer originally was no, but then they changed it to yes, and eventually they took the response down completely. Several of the handbooks released in the period of Gen 4 also considered Fioni a legendary or mythical Pokemon, but following the Rotom incident, we already know how reliable those can be. Fioni also gets filtered out by the GTS if the player excludes mythical Pokemon, and Fioni is not required in order to get the diploma for completing the Pokedex or the Shiny Charm, a trait usually exclusive to other mythicals. And while the game code for Pokemon Scarlet and Violet recognizes Fioni as a mythical, the code for Pokemon Bank and Pokemon Home does not. Ever since the introduction of Meltan, though, who is confirmed to be mythical despite being catchable multiple times and can evolve, it seems like evidence is now slightly in favor of Fioni indeed being a mythical. The fact that it can be hatched from eggs and bred to create more isn't all that unusual by today's standards as it was before. But where do you stand on this issue? Another Pokemon that has confused fans for years is of course my favorite Pokemon, Arcanine. The first reason is obviously the Pokedex classifies it as the legendary Pokemon. Not that that should mean anything, it's not like actual legendary Pokemon have the same classification. If anything, it's just a reference to Arcanine's rarity in-game and its importance to Chinese culture. However, the Pokedex hasn't referenced China since Gen 4, as Pokemon has continually built up its own world and reduced the number of references to real-life locations. Many people have used this in conjunction with Arcanine's abnormally high stats for a Gen 1 Pokemon, and this infamous mural from the second episode of the anime as evidence for Arcanine originally being intended as the Fire-type legendary. This theory gained so much traction throughout the 2000s and early 2010s that a lot of people actually take it as a fact. Many people actually believe that the original legendary trio was meant to be Articuno, Zapdos, and Arcanine. But Game Freak changed it to Moltres at the last second because 3 birds made more sense. But as I just stated, this is nothing more than a theory and has never been confirmed by any official sources. As for this mural in the anime, which is the real crux of the theory, bear in mind that the anime's producers don't actually have anything to do with Game Freak or the Pokemon Company. Yes, they did manage to put Ho-Oh in episode 1 and advertise many other early revealed Pokemon, but that doesn't mean they knew what the Gen 1 beta looked like and decided to reference it. Odds are some Japanese guy was probably like, well, we can't advertise Mew or Mewtwo yet, so let's just put Arcanine on the wall and call it a day. So to clear up any misunderstandings, no, Arcanine is not actually a legendary, and it likely never was intended to be one. Some people love to say that Junichi Masuda once confirmed this theory, but no, there's no source for this. It's just the internet version of a game of telephone where information gets misconstrued and turned into fake facts. And this is coming from Arcanine fan number 1, so you can take my word for it. Myth busted. And hey, real quick, if you're enjoying this video, it would mean the world to me if you subscribed. It's free and you'll get more great Pokemon content, so definitely consider it. Arcanine's not the only Gen 1 Pokemon to be called legendary, though, as the whole Dratini line would constantly be referred to as either legendary or mythical in a variety of Gen 1 promotional material, including the anime on many occasions. But pretty much the sole reason for this was to emphasize their extreme rarity in the games themselves. Unlike Arcanine, there wasn't much more confusion added on top of it, so most people could tell that they weren't actually legendary. It's just a term that they really liked to throw around for early pseudo-legendaries. Speaking of the anime warping people's perception of reality, we have Unknown. While Unknown is a mysterious Pokemon often associated with ruins and other things of legend, particularly Arceus, who they oddly seem to show up around a lot, there is nothing from the games themselves classifying them as legendary. The main point for people believing that they're legendary, of course, comes from the third movie, Spell of the Unknown, where Unknown appears in Molly's book about legendary Pokemon. Little did she know that she was reading the Diamond and Pearl Scholastic Handbook. If she turned the page, Delibird was gonna be there. Trust! But yeah, once again, while the anime's producers do have contact with Game Freak, they more often than not just make stuff up for the sake of the story. So really, the anime is one of the last things that should be determining who's legendary and who isn't. While Unknown is certainly a Pokemon associated with legendaries, they themselves are not. The anime's reign of terror doesn't end there though, because giving Lucario and Zoroark their own movies just contributed to a whole new wave of young fan confusion, compounded by the fact that these were either gift or event-exclusive Pokemon in their debut generations as well, making them appear like your standard mythicals for the most part. In fact, I'm pretty confident their pre-evolutions, Riolu and Zorua, exist for the sole purpose of trying to differentiate them from true mythicals. Lucario was probably the more confusing among the two, as it was the first non-legendary or mythical to star in a movie, discounting Unknown. By the time Zoroark came around, most people could tell that if Lucario wasn't legendary, this one probably wasn't going to be either. But Zoroark does have a stronger affiliation with legendaries like the Beast Trio, and in Super Smash Bros., it's the only non-legendary Pokemon, aside from Goldeen, that can be summoned from Master Balls. So there's just enough room for confusion. Returning to the games for a moment though, there is another Pokemon that oddly masquerades as a legendary, that being Volcarona. When it was first introduced in Gen 5, the only way of obtaining one without evolving Larvesta was to catch the single one living deep within the Relic Castle. Stat-wise, Volcarona is on par with Arcanine, who, again, isn't very far off the lowest tier legendaries. It similarly also has a fair bit of lore associated with it, as the Pokédex states that an ancient civilization once used it as a replacement for the sun during times of volcanic eruptions. In a way, its in-game encounter is handled very similarly to Rotom, minus the usage of the legendary music. I think Game Freak learned to not do that one a second time. But being a static encounter and at a whopping level 70, it's not hard to see why many people would have initially considered Volcarona as a legendary. In fact, there really isn't any reason not to consider it a legendary, aside from the fact that it evolves from Larvesta, but that rule has been broken quite a few times in the last few gens. Cosmog, Type Null, Cub Fu? But again, that just reinforces how confusing the guidelines can be sometimes. But hey, if you found this video interesting, then be sure to leave a like and subscribe for more videos just like this one. And you can check out some of my other videos if you want to learn more in the meantime. I'll see you guys next time.